So the next morning I could come in and take all the clamps out, and this video is going to be finishing up this table. So with the clamps off, this carriage is still disconnected from the carriages that ride in the trestles. Eventually this will all be one piece, but I had to finish up a few things before I permanently connected them. One of those was, if you remember from the beginning of the video, I had enough foresight to edge band parts of this ply before I glued it together. I wasn't so fortunate with this top piece here, so I had to go through and cut up some strips of walnut and edge band this one edge, because you will see it always even when the table's up or down, because it's on the outside. I wanted that to be a little more seamless. Also, these brackets they give you, the two mounting positions just weren't going to work for what I had, so I had to go through and drill another hole so that they could sit flush against the carriages I had made. You can see I put a mark on the top of it to kind of designate where I had to drill that new hole. It was really only off by about 1/2 of an inch, so I just marked it on both of these. I could put it in the drill press and drill out that hole. Obviously this is the size I'm using now, but with metal like this, because this wasn't aluminum, I think I used 3 different size drill bits, gradually worked my way up and drilled those in, and then you could see how that was mounted. Now originally I wanted to put the switch on one of the edges of this carriage, but you could see because of the aprons up top, it just wasn't going to fit, so I decided to mount it in the middle of the carriage. I wasn't super happy with this at first, because you're going to have to kind of reach under the aprons in order to press the buttons, but in the shop I'm working on this standing up, and it actually, you'll see at the end of the video I show how this works once it's all put together. Once you're sitting down, it's actually very simple to reach under the table, press this button, and then just move your hand to raise it up the rest of the way. So this ended up working out pretty nicely. I used a handsaw just to cut out that notch. You can see all this is hollow, so all of my wires will also fit in there, which is nice. And then once again, I'm wrapping up most of this. I don't have much left to make, so I could go through and put edge banding on all of these exposed plies. I have a supply of edge banding in the shop at this point, because I do work in plywood a lot. I hate edge banding. It's extremely boring to do, so I'm going through this pretty quickly. Just basically use walnut on all the end grain of the walnut and the cherry on the curves, and could finish all of that up. This stuff's pretty easy. It melts in place, and then you can just trim it down, and then I could lower the tabletop. The nice thing about this was, because it was hooked up to the linear actuators at this point, I can raise and lower it so that it's easier to work on. So like I said, when I was cutting this, the cherry I had wasn't exactly the height I needed, so I'm just going to shim it up to get it to the spot I want. I want this inner carriage to be flush with the top of the trestles, because this is what the tabletop actually attaches to. It does not attach at all to the outside of the frame. So you can see I'm just using those shims when I had it glued in place in order to get it to the top. And then to attach the tabletop, I was testing it out with figure 8s, but my preferred method these days are made in the shop tabletop fasteners. They're very simple to make. I have a biscuit joiner that I cut some slots with, and then with some oak I could test fit so that I have the right thickness of the edge that will go in that slot, and then I could just cut a series of these on the radial arm saw. This is only about 4 foot long, about 2 foot deep, so I only used 4. Now the way that these work is that they could slide in the slots, so as the tabletop changes with seasonal humidity, these tabletop fasteners will freely slide in the slot, and the table won't crack or bind on the surface. So you can see they're just little buttons that you make. They have the cutout for going in the slot, and then I pre-drill countersink holes in them just so it's a little bit cleaner on the other side of the table. There's the countersink, and then I drill a larger hole in the middle, because you don't actually want the screw connecting with these fasteners. So I drill a larger hole, and then the screws I'm using can slide through. I pretty much primarily use drywall screws in the shop because they're cheap, and I don't use a lot of hardware. Obviously wooden screws will work a little bit better for this, but I've never really had a problem. And then you can just see what I mean by that fastener can slide in this slot, as the tabletop changes in dimension, and that's basically how those will work. So now that everything's together, I could put the top on there, and like I said in previous videos, I had made this top much earlier than what I'm showing, but it made more sense to show how I made the base and then the top instead of kind of piecing it out the way I did it in real time. So I had this slab of maple. I knew I was using it for this table. It was pretty flat already. Someone who had their own workshop near my older workshop gave this to me years ago because they were moving and didn't want to take it with them. So I've had it sitting around for quite a while. It wasn't wide enough, but I also knew I had this piece of walnut for a modular built-in I made about 2 years ago, and it was a little too thick, which ended up working out perfectly because I used the cutoff from this for something else on the table. But same thing, I just rough cut it down to size, and then I cut it down to thickness. The maple's about 1 inch thick, so I cut this down to a little over 1 inch thick, and this was about, I believe, 1.25 inches in thickness when I started. So I still have that ripping blade in this table saw, which is nice. It makes quick, clean work of these things. So ripping down live edge is obviously going to be a little difficult because the edge isn't flat. So what I did to make this a little simpler on the table saw is I just used a piece of plywood, which is a guide that will run against my fence, and then that piece of plywood goes into a thinner strip of ply, and then I can drill that to the live edge slab. Now I'm drilling this into the bottom edge so you won't see these holes ever, because they're going to be on the underside of the table. This is just kind of a quick, simple way I could get around setting up some sort of fancy jig for cutting this down the middle, because I was going to obviously put that strip of walnut down the middle of this strip of maple, and that theme I kind of continued throughout the whole table, so there's a stripe of walnut that wraps around the whole center of the table. And you can see this worked perfectly. The fence rides against that flat edge of the ply, and I could get this cut down the middle pretty easily. It's a nice clean cut. I didn't have to joint anything at this point. Now, the walnut I had planed and jointed this when I got it for that original project. So you could see this went together pretty nicely. I didn't really mess with it too much. This was a very easy tabletop glue up. So that night I could put everything in clamps and just clamp everything together. This stuff wasn't warped too bad, but sometimes even if I'm putting clamps on the top of this, which I do, I will put some C-clamps on the edges just so that everything stays in place. And I let this set up overnight. And then the next morning I could come in and take this out of the clamps, and like I said, this was a very clean glue up. There was only a little bit of glue, so I was testing this tabletop out without really finishing it until the end. I'll obviously sand everything at the end, but that's how those tabletop fasteners work. Screws into the top, and once again this was a very sturdy connection. So with the top in place and risen, you could see just how sturdy it was. I was pleasantly surprised by how sturdy this all turned out. I thought there would be a little bit of give in it, and there really isn't much at all. So I was really happy with how that turned out. To finish up the base, like I said, I took the cutoff from the going over the top. I ripped it down to size. I put a little bit of an overhang as a nice detail at the bottom, but the problem was it was still a little too thick. And instead of ripping it down again, I just decided to mark where the bottom stretchers were, and then put little grooves on the edges, so this will have a flange in the middle, which will essentially snap into place in the base, and that's how I was going to put that on. I wanted that especially because I'm not gluing this on the bottom. If I ever have to change the linear actuators, it's going to be much easier to take this piece off, so this is just going to be attached with screws. But you can see how it's just two little flanges, just enough to hold everything in place and get it at the right thickness. And with the size raised a little bit, I could slide this in place, and like I said, it essentially snaps in because of that indent in the center. And then I could lower the actuators, it will hold it in place. And then, like I said, all I did from the bottom was I countersunk some holes and this is going to be screwed in place. I usually don't use screws as any sort of mechanical fasteners. I prefer joints, but like I said, foresight for this was if I ever had to make some changes to the actuators, my life would be so much easier if that piece could pop off. And then I could take this apart and start putting finish on it. You'll see the way I designed it was so that this could come apart easily. So all I have to do is undo those screws in the bottom, and then now this entire carriage is one piece. I could take it off and I could finish it. Then once I'm done, I could pop it back into place. The last thing I did to this was I put some 45s on the top side of these aprons, just a stylistic change. Really simple. I did that with a handsaw. And then I went through and sanded everything to about 150 grit. This yellow pine was already pretty smooth, like I said, and when I was milling this stuff up, the blade was brand new, so it gave it a nice smooth surface pretty much right off the bat. So there wasn't much sanding to do. For the top, I just ripped the edges clean. And then once again, this stuff was pretty clean as well, but I used a belt sander just to smooth out the top. I took that to about 120 as well. So I used a belt sander to smooth out, remove all the glue, and then the the orbital sander with about to 120 grit, and then that's how I finished the top. I don't get crazy with sanding. I know some people take this stuff up into the thousands, but especially with the finish I'm using, it kind of sands as you go. So Osmo oil is kind of my preferred finish at this point. I really like it. It makes the wood pop, it makes the wood look really natural, and it's a pretty durable finish. I apply it with these white Scotch-Brite pads, which also kind of sand the surface as you go to an extent. You can't have rough sawn lumber and expect to sand it as you go with these pads, but if you sand it to 120, 150 like I like to do, and put on 2 coats of this oil with those white pads, it leaves a really smooth, nice finish. The goal with this Osmo, it's very easy to apply. You just need to use it sparingly. A small bit will go a long ways. And once you have that coat on there, you really want to make sure to remove any excess because it will never dry. It will be sticky and make a mess. So this is the next day putting the second coat on. You could just see how nice and natural that finish is. And you really want to rub in all those coats. I only put 2 coats on everything. I could put the carriage back in place. It's a little sticky at first because I got some Osmo in my grooves, but you could see I got it in there nicely. And then, like I said, this table can come pretty much completely apart, which is what I wanted, but it's sturdy. I could slide the linear actuators back in, and then I'll show you how I wired everything up. So the wires can slide through those little holes that I put in there. Now for the electronics, I basically was using wire nuts. I'm just going to solder everything together. You can see the power supply is going to go to these 2 blue wires. Those were provided by the company. Those blue wires hook on these 2 fins on the end, and then this crossover is how you reverse the polarity of the switch to make it go up and down. So very simple stuff. You can see the extension and retraction. Those blue wires came with the switch, so I didn't have to do anything but put the power coming in, the 2 diagonals, and then the middle is going to be the power going out to the actuators, and it also gave me those. So I basically put those blue wires in place, soldered my red wires to the red leads of the actuators, my black wires to the black leads of the actuators, and then I put some heat shrink on there. Really simple stuff and nice solid connections. With the heat shrink in there, I'm actually going to put 2 layers on for extra durability, and then all this stuff will sit in the carriage, and if something happens to the wires, I could take the tabletop off and it's all accessible. Same thing with the power going in. I have 1 wire going to one wire going to the other, and I could just solder those together. So with these 2 blue wires, if I had the extension and the retraction mixed up when I first started doing this, so I just flipped the red and the white wires between the 2 blue wires, and then I had it going up perfectly. Same thing, heat shrink, and then this is done as well. To finish everything up, I do wrap all the cables together with some some electrical tape just so they can't get snagged on anything inside the carriage, but the heat shrink will work pretty well. And then you could see everything, the power supply, all of that fits right in that negative space in the carriage, so it's all hidden. There's just one wire coming out the back side. And then this footage, since I made this for someone in my family, like I said, I have access to it. So this footage was taken just the other day, and this has been in use for about 2 months. So far I'm really happy with the linear actuators. You can see the switch isn't hard to use, even though it's kind of underneath the table a little bit. It goes up and down seamlessly. It's super solid. I'm really happy with those products. This is just kind of some finished photos, and that will wrap up this project.